Hi, it is February 14th, 2025. Happy Valentine's Day, everyone. It's Dwyer of DwyerCrime.Blog, also gamblersadvisory.com. Let's talk about the JFK assassination. Let's talk about one of the biggest coincidences in history that I'm aware of. But first, remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, folks, what I consider to be the JFK murder conspiracy, which we should find out much more about when the Trump administration finally releases the documents. That murder conspiracy was never well put together. It had loose threads. It had untruths that the public was asked to believe. The ask was made because the public back then had less access to the information we have now. Right? The world was different. If you are older, you remember a time when very few adults had college degrees. College was really viewed as something that rich people did. You didn't have these robust student loan programs. Taking out student loans was really a foreign idea for most. If you're older, you remember a time when no adult around you, and I mean none, had a personal computer. There was no internet that was widely available for people to surf for information. If you lived in different parts of the country, sometimes you had to wait 24 hours to get news. I can tell you, I was raised in New York City, and games played on the West Coast, baseball games, you didn't know who won the game until you woke up the next day. Right? Sometimes you would have sportscasts where they wouldn't even have film of what happened in that night's game. You remember a time when most households, not just yours, but your friends' households, only had one landline phone. None of your friends had more than one phone number. If you were calling a buddy, you had to go through his family to get him on the phone. Right? His mom or dad would answer the phone. You would have to say, "Hey, is Joe available to talk? This is his friend, Rich." And they would then decide on whether they were going to get Joe for you. You didn't have the option, even if you were a teenager, to call Joe directly. Back then, nobody had a cell phone. There were no 24-hour news channels. Let me tell you, when Ted Turner debuted the idea, people laughed. It was simply preposterous. Who was going to tune into a TV outlet to hear news? Right? Understand, the news that was distributed was dominated by TV networks and by local newspapers. Right? The networks were the only people who had the resources to have someone on the West Coast or the East Coast actually attend events and give you what was happening. Watergate was broken by the Washington Post and the New York Times. Understand, you had very few national newspapers. So the Kennedy assassination was put together in that world. And in that world, things were heavily censored. Folks, it was not until the 1970s when, believe it or not, Geraldo Rivera aired for the American public for the first time after hours the Zapruder film. The American people had not seen it. They'd seen photos in magazines like Life magazine, but they hadn't actually seen the film until the 1970s. So the people covering up the truth had a several-year head start in doing so. And they had the cooperation of our Warren Commission, which incredibly had on it a former CIA director, Allen Dulles, who had been fired by John F. Kennedy, and who many thought had a link to Kennedy's assassination. Now, understand, there were credible witnesses, there always were, who knew that the official story was a lie. The doctors at Parkland Hospital saw a baseball-sized hole in the back of the president's head, and when interviewed, talked about it. What they saw is completely inconsistent with the story we were sold about how the president got shot, about the findings of the autopsy. Understand, since few people saw the Zapruder film, few people understood that the president's brain, much of it was shot out of his head. On the Zapruder film, you see his brain pop out of his skull. Folks, the autopsy has an intact brain. According to the autopsy, very little of the mass of the president's brain was missing. Right? Understand, that's inconsistent with the testimony of Clint Hill, the Secret Service member who talks about how parts of the president's brain flew around the car, and how when he looked at the president's eyes, and understand, back then, many people, Clint Hill, the president himself, had military experience. They had been around death. You're talking about a period, the 60s, that's after World War II, in the 40s. And it's after the Korean War. And when Clint Hill looked in the president's eyes, this is as the president is in the limo. Clint Hill is the Secret Service person who gets Jackie back in the limo. Clint Hill knew the president was gone because the president's eyes had a glazed glare on them. There was nothing behind the eyes. Now, understand what happened. The Zapruder film shows part of the president's brain coming out of his head. The autopsy, which is, in my opinion, faked and could not be faked by the mafia. Right? To fake the autopsy, you need government involvement. The autopsy has this pristine-looking brain, and just understand what happens next. While in government custody, the brain goes missing. Right? Today, we would easily be able to look at the brain. People in med school know that cadavers, they will take out brains from cadavers and have the students look at them. Right? We would quickly be able to determine that the brain was a cadaver brain we would quickly be able to determine that the DNA in the brain did not match Kennedy's DNA. So we would be able to determine that the autopsy was faked. Understand, that's not possible because the brain goes missing. Let's go one step further. You have the internet, you look up these terms. There's something called the Harper fragment. Days after the assassination, believe it or not, somebody walking through Dealey Plaza comes upon a bone fragment. This is a sizable bone fragment. This looks like it's blown off the back of someone's head. Right now, just understand, the Harper fragment is then taken, it's ultimately given to government. We should be able to determine whether the Harper fragment came from President Kennedy. If it did, then the back of the president's head was blown off. It leads to the question of, where did the bullet come from? Would the Harper fragment have been consistent with a shot from the back or a shot from the front that would blow off the back of the president's head, consistent with what the doctors at Parkland Hospital saw? Folks, like the alleged brain, while in government custody, the Harper fragment went missing. So, understand, the Kennedy assassination has loose threads, right? Many. You get the feeling that there are parts of the government that did not know what was going on. Right? The people in Texas wanted the autopsy of the president's body to be done in Texas in accordance with Texas law. Understand, federal people literally bullied, pushed a Texas official out of the way so they could leave the state with the president's body. Right? The autopsy, folks, is not done in Texas. When you think about this murder conspiracy, you need to understand that the shooting is just one part of the conspiracy. A major part of the conspiracy is the autopsy and the cover-up. And folks, there's a cover-up that's readily apparent as you do just some foundational internet searches. When you realize the president's brain's missing, when you now realize that the secret agent who found the magic bullet, the one that until now we were supposed to believe passed through Kennedy's body, goes through Governor Connolly's body, shatters Connolly's wrist. Right? We're supposed to have believed that. Now the agent has come forward. As people get older, when they're facing death, they will start talking about what actually happened in their lives. Secret agent has come forward and talks about how he found the body on the president's seat, not in the front of the limo, no, where the president was sitting, in the back of the limo. So let's talk about one of those coincidences that don't pass the smell test, that you know couldn't possibly be a coincidence. Now understand, John F. Kennedy fired CIA Director Allen Dulles. Now, if anyone knew the president's secrets, it would be the FBI and the CIA. It would be the intelligence community. Right now, the CIA was absolutely livid with John F. Kennedy because of the Bay of Pigs. Right? Kennedy did not provide military cover for the Cuban refugees who were trying to take back their island from evil Fidel Castro. That's how he was portrayed, right? A communist who had led a revolution. Now understand what the CIA knew about Kennedy. Understand what the truth was about Kennedy. Back in the 50s and 60s, it's heresy to actually portray a president of the United States as a vulnerable human being, someone who's making some questionable decisions in their lives. Right now, you and I know Warren G. Harding was a philanderer. You and I know that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a full-fledged mistress. In fact, he dies in her presence, not his wife's presence. You and I know that American history is flooded with flawed presidents. Right? We understand that. You know Ulysses Grant was an alcoholic. When you study history, it's multi-textured. Well, Kennedy had Addison's disease. Google it. He was on medication. Right? He had a doctor, believe it or not, who they called Dr. Feelgood. The feeling was that some of the medication Kennedy was taking impacted his judgment. Kennedy was romantically involved with Judith Exner, who actually called him at the White House. Judith Exner was the ex-girlfriend, if you believe she was ex, to mobster Sam Giancana. Right? In the 70s, by the way, Giancana would be assassinated before he testified to a House committee looking into John F. Kennedy's assassination. Someone killed Sam Giancana. Well, just to understand, too, that Kennedy was hanging around people who were rumored to have mob ties. Right? Kennedy was very public in his life. Right? He has the trophy wife, Jackie. He has young children. But he's also hanging out with notorious playboy Frank Sinatra. Right? Sinatra, of course, helped organize Kennedy's inaugural ball. Understand, Kennedy's Secret Servicemen would drive Kennedy to locations where Kennedy had liaisons. Kennedy, in terms of policy, was controversial. This is at a time of the Cold War. Kennedy believed that democratically elected communist leaders of foreign countries should be acknowledged and recognized. The fact that the leader was a communist shouldn't stop the United States from having diplomatic relations with them. What was important to Kennedy was that the leader was democratically elected. So just understand that's not the way the CIA saw things. So right before Kennedy gets into office, someone he was looking forward to working with, Patrice Lumumba, democratically elected in the Congo, who was a communist, gets killed with the cooperation of the CIA. For boxing fans out there, one of the people who participated in the killing was actually the leader of Dwyer, who put on the Rumble in the Jungle, one of boxing's high watermarks. Right? Just to understand, the CIA was actively involved in toppling democratically elected communist leaders of foreign countries. Well, of course, the Vietnam crowd firmly believes that Kennedy was about to withdraw American troops from Vietnam. Right? Something that Cold Warriors did not want to happen. So things escalated. Kennedy had a tension with the CIA. Understand, too, at a time when the FBI, was sending messages to Martin Luther King Jr. to undermine him, right? And truth be told, Martin Luther King Jr. was not a Boy Scout, right? He was a philanderer, as was Kennedy. At one point, Kennedy is sleeping with his wife's secretary. Understand, too, Kennedy's affairs, Kennedy's a guy in his 40s. Kennedy was sexually involved with some young women, plural, in their 20s at the White House. So this guy would have been viewed as controversial, is the word we'll use, by Cold Warriors, by traditionalists, right? He has this nuclear family image. He's far from nuclear family, right? This is a guy who, the rumor is, even had mental health concerns. Now understand, I say this, and I can openly say Kennedy's one of my favorite presidents in American history. I think an argument can be made he's the first modern president. Right? This is a guy who meets up with Dr. King. He's literally having an ongoing dialogue with the leaders of the civil rights movement. He has Dr. King at the White House. Understand, this is radical stuff in the early 60s. He's interfacing with people like Bayard Rustin, who is openly homosexual. Does not faze Kennedy in the slightest. In other words, Kennedy's view is he's pro-civil rights, right? The Civil Rights Act of 1963, which failed in Congress, was written from Kennedy's Oval Office, right? Wasn't written by lobbyists, wasn't written by the Senate, wasn't written by the House. No, civil rights was an issue for John F. Kennedy. It's written from the Oval Office. Understand, too, Kennedy's age plays a factor here. He's the youngest democratically elected president in American history, right? Teddy Roosevelt was younger than Kennedy when he became president, but that's because William McKinley got assassinated, right? Just understand, the people, if you believe the vote totals, and this is an open question, from the 1960 election, the people elected President Kennedy. So as he himself said, the torch had been passed to a new generation. Kennedy is a generational break, right? Some of the people from the older generation were not enamored. One of them was CIA Director Allen Dulles, right? Kennedy did not like the way the CIA tried to keep him out of the loop during the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy ultimately fires Allen Dulles. Now, let's pivot here to Lee Harvey Oswald. I believe the release of the Kennedy assassination papers are going to show us Who exactly was Lee Harvey Oswald? Right now, we have no idea. Right? We've been lied to. The lie is obvious in what I'm about to tell you. Right? Believe it or not, Lee Harvey Oswald is at a party on February 22nd, 2023. He's brought there by George de Mohrenschildt, who, of course, had deep state connections. Oswald has returned from Russia. Now, he's there. He has his wife, Marina, and they're briefly introduced to Ruth Payne. The release of the Kennedy papers is also going to tell us who Ruth Payne was. Right? Ruth Payne, the story goes, the story that's been widely distributed, is a housewife who's having problems with her husband, Michael Payne, and she's trying to learn Russian. So she has an interest in Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina Oswald. Now that's the story that's bandied about. Here's what else we know. Her sister, Sylvia Hoke, is a CIA employee. Her husband, Michael Payne, works for Bell Helicopter, a military contractor. Now, in one of the biggest coincidences in history, we are to believe that Ruth Payne, who, of course, the Oswalds end up staying with, Lee Harvey Oswald, ends up having problems with his wife, Marina. That marriage is strained, we're supposed to believe. Marina, of course, is pregnant. During the summer of 1963, Oswald at one point goes to New Orleans. The whole family was to go. Ruth Payne steps in, and Ruth Payne, offers to have Marina and the kids stay with her in the Dallas area. Understand, it's in the summer of 1963 that Lee Harvey Oswald has an office right next to Guy Bannister's office. Right, Bannister, of course, is a former deep state operative. It's in the summer of 1963 that Oswald is involved in an outfit called Fair Play for Cuba. And, of course, is actually interviewed on TV in New Orleans, talking about how Fidel Castro deserves fair play. Right? Now, let's be clear. Oswald is a Marine. Oswald defects to Cuba. Oswald then returns to the United States. Right? So now we're supposed to believe that Lee Harvey Oswald, who's in New Orleans by himself, is suddenly one of these people who is shilling for Cuba, which is controversial in the early 1960s. Well, just understand that Ruth Payne, the woman who wanted to learn Russian, who was interested in having Oswald's family stay with her, her husband, Michael Payne, who's a regular visitor to the house. Right, Michael Payne, who at one point goes to a John Birch Society meeting with Lee Harvey Oswald. Right, Oswald, the supposed communist, goes to a far right-wing group meeting with Michael Payne, the estranged husband of Ruth Payne. Just understand that Michael Payne came from money. Michael Payne's mother was Ruth Forbes Payne Young, from the very wealthy Forbes family of Boston. That family owned an island, Newshon Island, in the Northeast, near Martha's Vineyard. And just by chance, just coincidentally, at least that's how the story is told, Michael Payne's mother, Ruth Forbes Payne Young, was close friends with Anne Bancroft, who just happened to be the mistress of fired CIA Director Allen Dulles. In other words, whatever you think of Lee Harvey Oswald, understand Oswald had his family staying with the son of Allen Dulles' mistress's close friend. One wonders what Oswald knew at the time. Was Oswald aware that his family was staying with a military contractor whose wife had a sister who worked for the CIA, whose father, William Avery Hyde, worked for USAID, which was a cover for many CIA personnel? In other words, Lee Harvey Oswald's family is surrounded by people involved in the intelligence community, and of course, Newshon Island, where the Paynes, Ruth Payne, her husband, would vacation, right, was also a spot used for vacationing purposes by Michael Payne's mother's good friend Anne Bancroft, who herself was a spy, and her lover, CIA director, I should say fired CIA director, Allen Dulles. Right, folks? I don't believe in coincidences like that. It seems to me that Allen Dulles had close ties to Michael Payne. It seems to me that it's not happenstance that Lee Harvey Oswald's family, when Lee is going to New Orleans, is staying with Michael Payne and Ruth Payne. Right? It just simply, to me, suggests a widespread conspiracy. The question is, was Oswald steered into this situation, or was Oswald a willing participant in the situation? So let's talk about Oswald's job at the Texas School Book Depository. Right? If you believe Oswald's a lone nut, if you believe that Oswald is planning to kill the President of the United States, then one would assume that Oswald strategically gets that job. If you believe he's part of a bigger conspiracy, then you believe that Oswald knew that the President of the United States was going to be visiting the Dallas area, needed a job downtown, needed a job along the parade route, and knew when the president would be visiting, knew the parade route with the help of others. Folks, there's a much darker scenario. Right? Now, I'm not presenting anything here as truth. We're just speculating here. Right? But the darker scenario is that Lee Harvey Oswald has a background that can be exploited by others to frame him for a major assassination. Right? If you believe that possibility, then you understand how it could have come together. Buell Wesley Fraser, according to the folklore, just happened to have a job at the Texas School Book Depository. You know who knew it? Ruth Payne. So Ruth Payne gets Lee Harvey Oswald, and this is out of Case Closed, Gerald Posner's book. Ruth Payne gets Lee Harvey Oswald to apply for a job at the Texas School Book Depository. Now understand, folks, Oswald at the time, guy in his early 20s, does not have a driver's license. Right? Well, Ruth Payne helps Oswald get the job at the Texas School Book Depository. Now, mindful of libel laws, let me just say, again, I don't know what actually happened, but is it possible that Oswald is an innocent? Is it possible that Oswald thinks things are random, thinks he has randomly applied for a job in downtown Dallas? Again, young guy, right? I believe he is 24 when all of this happens, right? Turns 24. Is it possible that people around Oswald knew he's a defector and understood that he would be the perfect patsy? So just to understand how things go down, Oswald gets a job at the Texas School Book Depository. Right? The president's route is changed at the last minute, where the motorcade is going to drive by the Texas School Book Depository. The morning of the assassination, who's driving Oswald to work? Of course, it's Buell Wesley Fraser. Fraser's sister sees Oswald carrying a paper bag that Oswald claims had his lunch. Right? Another version of the story, and their versions, is that Oswald said that the bag had curtain rods in it. Now, what's not in dispute is that if you dismantle the Mannlicher Carcano rifle that Oswald owned, that was in Ruth Payne's garage, it would not fit under Oswald's arm. Right? Oswald's carrying this bag. The rifle wouldn't fit in the bag Oswald was carrying. That's according to Buell Fraser. That's according to Fraser's sister, both of whom see Oswald that morning. Right, folks? When the JFK papers are released, we're going to find out whether Oswald was even in the sniper's nest. Right? The boxes around the sniper's nest, understand they're putting in plywood on the 6th floor. So the workmen actually move boxes to the sniper's nest. Someone is shooting out the window. There's no question about that. The question is whether the person shooting out of the window was Lee Harvey Oswald. The Mannlicher Carcano rifle is misaligned. Oswald has no gunpowder residue on the side of his face. Right? Let's think it through. All of these recreations of the crime have Oswald looking through the scope with his cheek up against the rifle. It doesn't make sense if Oswald is holding the gun out. The way the windows are in the 6th floor, Oswald would have to be crouched down. Importantly, the paper that the gun was allegedly carried to work in does not appear in any of the photos taken of the sniper's nest. Folks, it's a cover-up it's a bad cover-up. Understand, too, the bullets don't match up. Right? The bullet that hits the sidewalk that results in an injury to James Tague, where does that bullet come from? Right? That's for those who believe in the magic bullet. Where does that bullet come from? Right? The bullets don't match up. The logistics don't match up. The sniper's nest photos don't match up. And understand, there are women by the elevator bay who hear the shooting, who then moments later are on that back staircase. They never see Lee Harvey Oswald. Right? Never. So what I want people to consider here is a simple question. Do you believe it's sheer coincidence that the CIA director that John F. Kennedy fired had a mistress who just happened to be best friends, very close friends, with the mother of Ruth Payne's husband? Right? The Paynes, of course, are who Lee Harvey Oswald's family was staying with. Right? Do you believe that's happenstance? I don't. Do you believe it's also happenstance that that same fired CIA director, Allen Dulles, would then get appointed by Lyndon Baines Johnson to the Warren Commission? Right? I don't understand how Kennedy could fire a CIA director. You want to make sure that people in a fact-finding tribunal don't have a motive to undermine the tribunal. How does spy Allen Dulles end up on the Warren Commission? Right? Let's go one step further. There's a bullet wound on the back of John F. Kennedy. Right? Who on the Warren Commission changes the location of that bullet wound so that the magic bullet theory is even viable? Now, believe it or not, it was Gerald Ford. And the reason Ford is an interesting person in history is because in the 70s, when Richard Nixon was going down, Nixon on the White House tapes starts saying he knows what happened in that Bay of Pigs thing. Right now, Nixon, of course, needed a vice president. Who ends up being his vice president? Gerald Ford. You got the feeling that Nixon flew too close to the sun and had to pick a vice president to replace Spiro Agnew, who was acceptable to the deep state. Right? Ford's interesting too. Because, of course, we view Ford as, some easygoing guy. We now know that Ford, who was very close friends with J. Edgar Hoover, was likely the FBI's mole on the Warren Commission. Understand, too, there were people on the Warren Commission who did not believe, right? Lyndon Johnson, who I feel is playing both sides, had a friend, Russell, on the Warren Commission who just didn't believe that Lee Harvey Oswald could have gotten off the shots. Right? So what you had was a political tribunal on which, of course, Allen Dulles was on. So the deep state had access to everything that was happening in the Warren Commission. You had a military tribunal, not a military tribunal, you had a presidential tribunal with people like Earl Warren who did not want to serve on the Warren Commission, right? And there was political pressure to find Lee Harvey Oswald to be a lone nut. Do any of us think that Allen Dulles disclosed to the Warren Commission that his mistress was close friends with Michael Payne's mother? Probably not. Right? The Warren Commission is a dog and pony show. The real question is, how much of the conspiracy did Lee Harvey Oswald know about? Right? Is he working in a building, in a job that Ruth Payne suggested for him, without thinking that Ruth Payne might have a motive? Right? Understand, too, the way things work. One of the biggest reasons why the papers haven't been released to the public is because of the fact that everyday citizens were tangentially involved in the Kennedy assassination. Right? The idea is that you want to protect the Ruth Paynes of the world, people who just happen to be providing room and board for the Oswald family. Right? You didn't want their names leaked to the public because you might have some people who would feel that some innocent person who happened to, give a cab ride to Lee Harvey Oswald on the day of the assassination might be targeted by others for having innocent tangential involvement in what happened to the President of the United States. I believe the question has to be asked, without naming any names, whether in fact the involvement was tangential. Right? Whether in fact the involvement was innocent. I want people online to Google the attempted assassination of Edwin Walker and find out what Ruth Payne told law enforcement. Just understand they're witnesses to the General Walker assassination attempt. They're witnesses. Right? Lee Harvey Oswald does not have a driver's license. The person who shot at Walker is able to drive away with someone else from that scene. Right? If you, in doing your research, find that Ruth Payne was instrumental in having law enforcement focus on Lee Harvey Oswald, that would open up a whole new list of questions. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, right? I have to be mindful of libel laws. But let's just say you should have a skeptical, analytical eye in hearing all of this, right? Understand, Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle is found on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. Open question on whether he put it there. Right? That rifle was being kept in Ruth Payne's garage. I'll just put it this way. Someone certainly is shooting a rifle out that window. There certainly are shells that are on the floor, left on the floor, right, that came from that rifle, right? The question we all should be asking ourselves is, who's shooting the rifle? Given that Oswald has no gunpowder residue on the side of his face, right? Given that no fingerprints of Oswald's are found on the rifle, right? The question should be, how did the rifle get there? Was there planning? Where is the paper that the rifle was transported to the building, right? How come there are photographs of it outside the building? How is it possible that the President of the United States could be assassinated? The photos of the sniper's nest have photos of the rifle shells on the floor, right? They have photos of the boxes around the sniper's nest. There's even a photo of the rifle, which is between some of the boxes, right? How could there not be any photos of the paper that authorities claim was also in the sniper's nest? It makes no sense, right? So, just food for thought. Is it a coincidence that Alan Dulles, fired by John F. Kennedy, has a mistress who knew the Payne family? I just find that coincidence to be too big. In a world of billions of people, how's that even possible? Let me also point out, too, February 22nd, 1963, when Ruth Payne first encounters the Oswald family, is 7 months. Right? Actually, it's, February to November. It's 9 months to the day. In other words, the Oswalds didn't know the Paynes that well. But yet the Paynes knew Alan Dulles. It's unbelievable. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.